sleet stung Patricia Schmidt's face as she crossed the market square, and the basket on her arm grew heavier with each step because silver, even tarnished silver, had the stubborn weight of a house being stripped piece by piece. Dawn had not yet broken cleanly. The sky was a low lid of iron. Her gloves had split at both forefingers, and the cold found skin at once, sharp as pins, then dull as stone. Water gathered inside her boots with every stride. It soaked her stockings. It numbed her toes until she could not feel where leather ended and flesh began. She kept walking. Lady Norwood had sent her before first light with 6 candlesticks, wrapped in old linen, and precise instructions to return with coin, not excuses. Patricia had eaten nothing since yesterday afternoon, a crust gone hard at the edges, and hunger now worked through her in slow turns, hollow and humiliating. She did not bend under it. She did not hurry either. To hurry invited comment. To hesitate invited worse. At the pawn shop near the Shambles, she waited between a butcher's widow and a carter with a broken harness, while rain tapped the warped window, and the rooms smelled of damp wool, old brass, and vinegar. The widow glanced at Patricia's mantle, too thin for the weather, then at the silver peeking from the linen. Recognition came first, then contempt dressed as amusement. "Blackthorn Hall is trimming itself," the woman said to no one in particular. The pawnbroker, Mr. Keel, lifted one candlestick, turned it in his palm, and named a sum deliberately low. Patricia repeated the amount back to him in careful English, then gave the valuation of silver weight and workmanship, exactly as her father had taught her when she was 12, and trusted to hold his ledger inkpot steady. Under strain, her clipped German vowels returned at the edges of words she had spent years sanding smooth. A young clerk laughed. The carter smirked openly. "Mr." Keel's mouth twisted, as if the accent itself made arithmetic suspicious. Patricia met his eyes, recited his own posted rates from the board behind him, and asked for what was fair. She did not raise her voice. She did not look at the clerk again. When he counted out the coins at last, she counted them twice before touching the receipt to dry wax. Her hands shook anyway. She hid them by folding the paper inside her sleeve. Outside, the rain had thickened. She stood in it for one breath longer than needed, lifted her chin, and walked to the coaching yard, as if no one had watched her bargain like a servant in a room where once her father had sent footmen on his behalf. By the time the public coach reached the lane to Blackthorn, morning had settled in without warmth. 3 market women and a cooper's apprentice rode opposite her, all mud-spattered, all exhausted, all kinder in silence than many gentlewomen she knew. No one spoke after the first mile. Wheels struck ruts. The carriage lurched. Patricia kept one hand over the purse hidden in her pocket, and one on the seat edge to steady herself when pain shot through her fingers. Her knuckles had split where she had gripped the iron rail climbing aboard. At the estate gates, she climbed down without help and walked the final stretch because Lady Norwood would not pay the extra shilling for the drive. Blackthorn Hall rose through mist, stone dark with rain, windows blank, chimneys breathing little. It had once appeared to her as certainty. It now looked like a creditor. She entered by the servants' door. No fire waited there, no breakfast tray. Mrs. Davies, the cook, gave her half a cup of weak tea without speaking, and turned away quickly when she saw Patricia's hands. Kindness in that house survived only in gestures brief enough to deny. The day unfolded in the old pattern that had become law by repetition. She carried coal to the second-floor grates until her shoulders burned. She scrubbed mud from the back passage, where the hunting dogs had been led through. She mended a torn hem on Miss Norwood's evening gown, fingers pricked raw because the silk was fine and the light in the attic was poor. She polished boots that were not hers, then stitched one of her own soles with twine by the pantry wall while waiting for hot water that did not come. She ate after the servants, as always, because Lady Norwood had declared that a ward must learn gratitude through restraint. The meal was turnip broth thinned past honesty and a heel of yesterday's loaf. She swallowed quickly before one of the maids could be blamed for generosity and have her wages docked. Patricia slept in the attic room above the west eaves, under a slant of roof where winter pushed itself through the boards and summer trapped heat like punishment. The bed sagged in the middle. The picture cracked last month and had not been replaced. Her dresses hung from one nail, each mended twice, each altered down from richer cloth that had once belonged to her stepsisters. In drawing rooms she was our poor Miss Schmidt, spoken with a soft pity that carried no obligation. In household disputes she became Miss Schmidt, with clipped precision, summoned only when fault required a surname. Her father had been Otto Schmidt, naturalised and respected, a man who invested in mills and river transport and read legal briefs at supper for pleasure. He had married again after Patricia's mother died, and the second marriage had been spoken of as prudent. Fever took him in 6 days. The lawyer sealed a trust in his study under witnesses. Lady Norwood wept in black silk for exactly 1 season, then announced debts that no one outside her circle was permitted to inspect. Patricia's dowry jewels vanished first. Then the pianoforte was locked. Then the library key. Books disappeared from shelves 1 row at a time and were said to have been sold for coal, though the house remained cold. Her accent became Lady Norwood's favourite instrument. At table she would request sweetly, "Read this line for our guests, dear child," then smile when laughter followed a hard consonant or misplaced stress. Patricia had learned to answer in shorter sentences. She had learned to let silence take blows language could not soften. She had also learned what Lady Norwood had never guessed, that ledger columns spoke in patterns, that signatures changed pressure when forged, that rents could be collected and still not appear in accounts if one knew where to bury them. Late each night, when the household settled and doors ceased to open, she copied figures by candlelight onto scraps cut from old bills, dates, initials, missing sums. She kept them beneath the loose board under her bed, wrapped in oilcloth against damp. By the second week of November she had begun checking the North tenant rents against grain deliveries every evening, because numbers did not sneer when she pronounced them correctly. That night her candle burned low in its socket while wind worried the attic panes. She sat at the narrow table with ink staining the side of her hand and copied the household accounts Lady Norwood had left half open after brandy. 3 signatures on debt instruments matched too closely. 2 rent payments had been entered twice under different headings. 1 line for repairs named a mason dead these 3 years. Patricia paused, listened for steps, then wrote the false entries again in a separate hand for certainty. Her stomach cramped with hunger. Her back ached from bending. Rain tapped and then rattled the glass. Downstairs, laughter rose through the floorboards in bright, cruel bursts as carriages arrived for dinner. Silver chimed. Doors opened and closed. She could smell roasting meat from 2 floors below, rich and impossible to ignore. She set down the pen only when wax reached her fingers and burned. The knock on her door was not a knock at all, only the 3 sharp strikes and the turn of a key that Lady Norwood kept, despite calling the room Patricia's private quarters. Silk rustled in the threshold. Lavender entered before the woman did. Lady Norwood's gaze moved once over Patricia's plain dress, inked fingertips, unpinned damp hair, and paused with visible distaste on the copied pages. "You will come downstairs now," Lady Norwood said. "We require entertainment before the fish course." Patricia rose, tucked the papers beneath the loose board with one practised motion, and smoothed her skirt over knees gone stiff with cold. "As you wish, Lady Norwood." "Speak clearly tonight," Lady Norwood added, smiling without warmth. "Try not to disgrace us with your vowels." Patricia lowered her eyes because defiance had a cost she could not pay before witnesses, and followed her toward the lit staircase, carrying in her pocket the pawn receipt, in her fingertips the sting of split skin, and in her memory each false figure that had been written in her father's house under another woman's name. She followed Lady Norwood down the back stair, one hand sliding along the polished rail where varnish had been renewed each spring while the servants' treads were left to splinter, and every step carried her deeper into light that did not belong to her. Heat gathered as they descended, thick with beeswax, roasting meat and orange peel set to simmer in the kitchen for fragrance. Yet the warmth did not soften the ache in her fingers. It only woke it. At the turn by the portrait gallery, Lady Norwood moved ahead without looking back, silk whispering against the runner, and Patricia saw what she always saw when she crossed that landing. Her father's likeness hung too high and too far from the candles, pushed between two Norwood ancestors, as if Otto Schmidt had been an inconvenient purchase rather than the man who paid for this wing. The painter had captured him with one hand resting on a ledger, not a sword, dark hair already silvering at the temples, eyes direct, mouth stern, until he smiled. She remembered that smile with a precision that hurt. He had smiled at numbers balancing after midnight. He had smiled when she corrected a clerk twice her age on freight duty calculations. He had smiled the first time she read a legal clause aloud without stumbling, then made her read it again until she heard the hidden condition for herself. No one had smiled at her learning since he died. Lady Norwood paused at the drawing-room door and said, low enough that only Patricia heard, "Should anyone ask, you will say your father left burdens, not assets. You will not improvise." The words were plain. The threat was older than the sentence. Patricia inclined her head. She had heard versions of this instruction for 5 years, through morning ribbons, summer assemblies, and winters when coal was rationed to the attic, while the blue salon burned 2 fires at once. Behind the half-open door, laughter struck glass and returned bright. Her stepsisters, Eleanor and Jane Norwood, stood before the mirror in ivory and amethyst, their hair pinned with combs that had once belonged to Patricia's mother. Eleanor held up a fan and said, "There she is, our German governess, in borrowed sleeves." Jane turned, looked Patricia over from wet hem to frayed cuff, and added, "Try not to frighten the gentleman when you speak." Lady Norwood did not rebuke them. She adjusted Jane's necklace instead, touching the clasp with satisfaction. Patricia knew that necklace. Her father had bought it in Bath the year he married again, when promises were still spoken in full and paid in advance. Tonight the diamonds lay at Jane's throat while Patricia's own collar had been turned twice to hide-wear. She stood silent until Lady Norwood dismissed her with a flick of 2 fingers toward the service corridor, and she went because silence had become her safest form of arithmetic. What was endured now could still be counted later. In the still room, Martha met her with a tray of folded napkins and one hard glance that asked if Patricia had eaten. Patricia gave the smallest shake of her head. Martha pressed half a cold potato into her palm, while the kettle hissed, then turned away before anyone could accuse her of favouritism. Even kindness had to move quickly in Blackthorn Hall. Patricia swallowed in 2 bites, barely tasting salt, and changed into the dark service dress kept on a peg for evenings when Lady Norwood wished to display humility among her luxuries. The bodice had been taken in so often the seams formed ridges beneath her skin. The cuffs ended above her wrists, exposing the yellowed, fading marks left from a grip too tight last week when a tray had rattled. She pulled the sleeves down anyway. In the narrow mirror, her face looked thinner than it had in summer. Dark hair escaped every pin. Her eyes seemed larger for the hollows beneath them. Plain, people called her, and the word had been repeated so frequently it was expected to settle as truth. Yet plain women were rarely watched with such deliberate contempt, rarely corrected for how they held a spoon, rarely instructed where to stand so no guest might mistake them for family. Plainness had become another instrument, useful because it could be spoken as mercy while used as punishment. As she tied the apron strings, old losses passed through her not as recollection, but as weight in the body. The morning after her father's funeral, Lady Norwood took the library keys and said grief required order. A week later, the pianoforte in the morning room was locked and covered. A month after that, Patricia's French tutor was dismissed. By winter, 2 trunks of her mother's books had been sold to a dealer in York, and Lady Norwood told callers the house had always contained too much foreign nonsense. Patricia had gone to the empty shelf that night and stood with her hand on the wood until the grain pressed into her palm. Eleanor and Jane took other things more lightly, with laughter and selection, as if sorting ribbons after a ball. Eleanor chose Patricia's blue velvet pelisse because the colour does not suit your pallor. Jane chose the garnet drops Otto had promised for Patricia's 21st birthday and wore them to church while asking if they were too dark for mourning. Their theft was always performed as correction. Their cruelty was always spoken as refinement. When Patricia protested once, quietly, Lady Norwood answered in front of the housemaid, "You mistake possession for entitlement, Miss Schmidt. You have no dowry now. You have duty." Duty had since expanded to fill every room she entered. By the time the first course was carried in, rain lashed the long windows and the dining room had been transformed into an argument against scarcity. Candles multiplied along silver branches she had polished herself that afternoon. Crystal caught firelight and fractured it into cold stars above each place setting. White roses, imported at needless expense, shed petals onto linen while Lady Norwood spoke of prudent management to men who owned neighbouring lands, and women who tracked rank as closely as weather. Patricia moved behind chairs with the soup tureen steady in her hands, shoulders level, steps measured to the width of the parquet inlays her father had commissioned when trade was good and wages were paid on time. She knew each board. She knew where one lifted in damp. She knew which hearth smoked if the flue was not opened before dusk. Knowledge had become another form of servitude under Lady Norwood, called upon whenever something failed and erased whenever something prospered. At the far end of the table, Mr. Holbridge, from the bank, discussed debt recovery with professional cheer. Lady Norwood lowered her lashes and spoke of burdens inherited from a husband too trusting in business partners. Patricia set his wine and felt her jaw tighten. Otto Schmidt had not been trusting. He had been meticulous to the point of irritation. He verified freight twice. He refused unsecured notes. He corrected titles in contracts with his own pen. Yet, after his death, promissory papers appeared bearing his name with signatures that leaned wrong, pressure heavy on the wrong letters. The final stroke too flourished for his hand. Patricia had seen those papers when Lady Norwood forgot to lock the escritoire. She had copied dates at midnight and hidden them under the floorboard while wind pushed soot down the chimney. Twice in the first year Mr. Fenwick, the solicitor her father had trusted, came to call and was told Lady Norwood was indisposed. Once Patricia waited in the hall hoping to catch him as he left, but Jane intercepted her with a smile and asked if she intended to discuss legal matters in that apron. The footman shut the door before she could speak. After that, Lady Norwood announced that all correspondence would pass through her private secretary, and letters addressed to Patricia stopped arriving unless already opened. If Patricia asked after the trust, she was told there was none. If she asked after accounts, she was told women of uncertain background ought not concern themselves with figures above household lists. The accusations shifted shape each season: foreign, ungrateful, unmarriageable, burdensome. The words changed, but the function did not. Keep her small, keep her hungry, keep her doubting what she remembered in her father's own voice. When the fish course ended, Lady Norwood signalled for music, then decided against it with theatrical regret, and requested instead that Patricia read aloud from a stack of correspondence, to spare us the melancholy of another sonata. It was done lightly, as if spontaneous, though the letters had already been arranged near Patricia's place at the sideboard, and the German shipping notice lay on top where any eye could find it first. Patricia felt the old heat rise from collar to cheek. She took the papers because refusal would be called insolence, and insolence would be punished where no guest could witness. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, smiling into her glass. Jane looked directly at Patricia and formed the word vowels without sound. Lady Norwood said, "Do make haste, child. The gentlemen are curious how commerce sounds in Hamburg." Patricia began with the English invoice, voice level despite the dryness in her throat. 2 lines in, Mr. Halbridge interrupted to ask where she had been educated. Before she could answer, Lady Norwood supplied, "By accident, mostly." Laughter went around the table, easy and practised. Patricia read the second letter, then lifted the German notice because not lifting it would only delay the same humiliation. The script was dense, mercantile hand. She translated as she went, precise and fast, and the room quieted despite itself because competence can command attention even from those determined to withhold respect. She reached a title, rendered it in English, and Lady Norwood struck the back of her hand with a dessert spoon, sharp enough to sting and make the page tremble. "Not baron, baronet. You flatten everything," Lady Norwood said, "even language." The room shifted, not in sympathy but in appetite. Cruelty had become the evening's entertainment, and they had paid for front seats with compliments and claret. Patricia steadied the letter. She tasted metal where she had bitten her tongue. She said, "The original text states Freiherr, Lady Norwood. Baron is the nearer equivalent." Silence followed, thin and dangerous. Lady Norwood's smile hardened. "You will not correct me in my house." The sentence landed with the old deliberate emphasis. My house. Patricia lowered her eyes because the pulse in her throat had begun to pound visibly, and visibility was always used against her. "Forgive me," she said, and the words scraped on the way out. The next letter blurred for one breath before she forced the ink back into focus. Rain battered the panes. The fire snapped. Somewhere in the corridor a clock marked the quarter hour with small, pitiless chimes. Patricia read until dismissed, then returned to the wall behind Lady Norwood's chair where servants stood invisible unless summoned. She could feel where the spoon had struck, a hot line swelling across her knuckles. She folded that hand into the other. Across the table, Eleanor now wore Patricia's mother's pearls, the cream ones once wrapped in blue paper at the back of the dressing case, and the sight made grief rise so abruptly it seemed physical, like a misstep on stairs. Her mother had died when Patricia was 14, too quickly for apologies, too quickly for instructions beyond a fevered request to care for her father and keep speaking both languages so she would never be half herself in any room. Patricia had kept that promise in secret. She read English law by candle and German trade circulars by dawn when she could steal 10 minutes beside the kitchen fire. She spoke less because each syllable was measured by those waiting to mock it. She listened more because listening survived where argument failed. She endured because endurance was the only coin still accepted from her. Yet standing there now, back straight against panelled oak, while Lady Norwood accepted praise for household grace and prudent stewardship, Patricia understood with a clarity that chilled more than the wet in her boots ever had. Every humiliation had been designed to make her appear uncertain at the precise moment certainty would matter. Hunger weakened memory, shame fractured speech, isolation made even true facts sound like invention. Lady Norwood had not merely taken objects, wages, music, books. She had attempted to strip credibility itself. Patricia pressed her thumb into the swollen ridge on her hand until pain steadied her breathing. In the attic above them, under the loose board, copied figures waited in silence. Dates did not blush. Totals did not defer to rank. Signatures either matched or they did not. She fixed her gaze on the silver at the centre of the table, bright enough to reflect faces in warped miniature, and held herself still while laughter rose again around her father's candles, in her father's room, beneath her father's roof. A sharp crack sounded from the front drive, loud enough to cut across the clink of forks, and then came the shout, raw and close, not from a servant's measured throat, but from a man running at full speed through rain. The dining-room doors flew inward hard enough to strike the panelling. Wind and wet entered with the footman who stumbled in, white-faced, his livery dark at the shoulders. Lady Norwood, an accident at the lower bridge, the Ashcombe curricle turned. Master Henry is hurt. For one breath, no one moved. Lady Norwood rose so quickly her chair scraped the floor. You will compose yourself, Thomas. This is a dinner, not a stable yard. Another shout answered from the hall, nearer now, and a groom appeared behind the footman with a boy in his arms, perhaps 8 years old, limp with shock, hair plastered to his brow, one sleeve soaked through where the cloth clung darkly to skin. Mud streaked the parquet. Water dripped from the groom's boots in quick, relentless taps. The women at table recoiled. One guest gave a thin cry and pressed lace to her mouth. Mr. Halbridge stood half up, then sat again, as if uncertainty itself had weight. Lady Norwood's voice sharpened to a blade. Take him to the servants' quarters, at once. Do not stain my carpets. The boy made a small sound then. Not a cry, but the strangled breath of someone trying not to cry, and Patricia was moving before permission could be granted or withheld. She set down the silver she still held, crossed the room, and reached for the child with both hands. Here, by the fire, she said to the groom. Lay him on the rug. Gently, keep his neck straight. Lady Norwood turned on her with disbelief made furious by witnesses. Miss Schmidt, you will stand back. Patricia did not look up. She knelt on wet wool, skirts drinking mud, and touched 2 fingers to the boy's throat, counting pulse against her own shaking breath. Fast, thready, alive. Martha, she called toward the service door, voice carrying cleanly now. Boiled water, clean cloths, and the brandy chest key. Quickly! Martha was already running. The groom sank to one knee, breathing hard. He was thrown, miss. Wheel struck stone. His lordship is behind us. At that, the room altered. The name moved through the guests in whispers that were almost reverent. Ashcombe. Duke Elias Ashcombe. War-scarred, widowed. A man spoken of in lowered voices by those who had never met his eye. Lady Norwood's face changed in an instant from anger to calculation. He cannot see this chaos, she hissed. Remove the child now. Patricia slid her hand under the boy's shoulder and felt him flinch. No, she said, still kneeling. If his collarbone is broken, moving him will worsen it. The sentence fell into the room like a thrown stone. Eleanor stared as if Patricia had spoken blasphemy. Jane laughed once, short and unbelieving. Lady Norwood stepped forward and caught Patricia's wrist. "You forget yourself!" Her grip found the old bruises under Patricia's cuff. Pain flashed white. Patricia did not pull away. "I remember myself exactly," she said, low enough that only Lady Norwood and the nearest guests heard. "He needs warmth and stillness." The long case clock in the corridor struck 10, while rain battered every window in the hall, each chime dividing the evening from what it had been 10 minutes before. Hoofbeats hammered the front stones. The door slammed. Heavy steps crossed the entrance in a hard, unbroken sequence, then stopped at the dining room threshold. He filled the doorway like bad weather given a human shape. Tall, broad through the shoulders, greatcoat soaked black, dark hair rain-slicked against a face carved in severe planes, a pale scar cutting from temple toward cheekbone like an old map line no one dared mention. His eyes found the boy first. Then they found Patricia on her knees in mud and candlelight. He took in everything at once, the child on the rug, the torn cuff, the handprint rising at Patricia's wrist, the hostess standing over her with silk unrumpled and jaw set. "Report," he said. One word, no greeting, no bow. The groom answered at once. "Turned wheel at the bridge, your grace. Horse-shied, Master Henry thrown. Miss Schmidt pulled him clear from the run-water by the stones." Patricia glanced up sharply. She hadn't known anyone from the bridge had followed. Recognition struck half a beat later. The rider from the riverbank. The man in the storm who had dismounted without hesitation and cleared panic with his voice, alone. She had seen him then only through rain and urgency, a figure beside cold water while she held a shivering child against her chest. Now candlelight gave him a title and made him more dangerous, not less. Duke Elias Ashcombe stepped into the room and removed his gloves with precise, economical movements, as if fury itself had been drilled into discipline years ago. He crouched beside the boy. "Henry!" The child's eyelids fluttered. "Uncle!" The single word was thin. The Duke's hand, large and scarred across the knuckles, came to rest on the rug beside the boy's shoulder, rather than on the boy himself, as though he measured pressure even in comfort. His gaze cut to Patricia. "Stop shaking! Hand him to me!" Her hands were shaking. She had not known until he named it. She steadied them by pressing her palms briefly to her own skirt and answered in the formal tone drilled into her by years of correction. "He cannot be moved yet, Your Grace." A murmur ran down the table. Defiance from a dependent girl to a duke should have sounded like social suicide. Instead, the Duke held her eyes for a long beat, then gave one tight nod. "What do you require?" She did not permit herself relief. "Blankets, 2 boards. A surgeon summoned from the village. He struck stone at the shoulder and possibly the head." The Duke rose in one fluid motion and turned to the room. "You heard her?" No one moved. His voice dropped colder. "Now!" Chairs scraped. Footmen ran. Mr. Halbridge stumbled toward the bell-pull and rang with such force the cord jerked in his hand. Martha arrived with steaming water and cloths and nearly collided with a maid carrying quilts. Lady Norwood stepped forward, smile restored but brittle at the edges. "Your Grace, had we known—" He did not look at her. "Clear this table!" The command was not loud. It did not need to be. Crystal vanished. Silver disappeared. Guests rose in hurried disorder, gathering skirts, avoiding the spreading water on the floor as if it was scandal made visible. Patricia bent over the boy again. "Henry, can you tell me where it hurts most?" His teeth chattered. "Shoulder and here." He tried to lift his hand toward his temple and winced. Patricia caught his fingers gently and lowered them. "Do not move your arm. You are brave. Stay with me." She asked for the scissors, cut away the wet sleeve with careful snips, and exposed swelling above the clavicle. No break through the skin. Thank God for small mercies. She folded cloth, made a sling, and spoke to him in a low cadence she remembered from years ago, from nursery rhymes in 2 languages, whispered through fever nights, when her own mother still lived. She did not notice when she shifted into German for the soothing phrases, only that Henry's breathing slowed as she did. Across from her, the Duke went utterly still, not the stillness of indifference, the stillness of a man listening to a sound he had not expected to hear again. Lady Norwood heard it too. "Miss Schmidt," she said sharply, "English, if you please. We are not in a dockside tavern." Patricia's shoulders tightened. She translated at once, voice flat. "You are safe, Henry. Breathe slowly. Look at me." The boy obeyed. The Duke looked up then, and there was something in his expression she could not read. A controlled violence turned inward. "Who struck her?" he asked. No one answered. His gaze moved to Patricia's hand where the red welt from the spoon had deepened into a swelling ridge. Then to the older marks at her wrist, yellow at the edges, fresh beneath. He spoke without raising his voice. "Liar is an ugly word, Lady Norwood, yet it applies easily in this room. She is covered in bruises." Lady Norwood drew herself up, silk rustling with offended dignity. "Your Grace, this girl is clumsy and dramatic. She invents injuries when corrected." Patricia wished then fiercely that he would let it pass. Attention had always carried cost, but the Duke's eyes did not leave Lady Norwood's face. "No one touches her again." The sentence landed with the force of law. Eleanor flushed scarlet. Jane looked toward the door as if calculating exits. Guests who had stayed to witness now examined their gloves and said nothing. From the corridor came hurried steps. Dr. Weller, grey-whiskered and out of breath, entered with his satchel and stopped at the scene on the dining-room floor. Duke, child, drenched rugs, and Patricia kneeling in a service dress with mud to her hems and blood drying in rust-coloured threads at her cuff. "Your Grace," he began. The Duke stepped back half a pace but remained close enough to shadow the boy from the draught. "Examine him," he said. "Miss Schmidt will assist you." Dr. Weller blinked once, startled, then nodded. "Very good." Patricia passed instruments, held the lamp steady, and repeated what she had observed. Pulse, responsiveness, pain response, likely clavicle fracture, no visible skull fracture, possible concussion. The surgeon listened, tested, and finally grunted reluctant agreement. Well assessed. He set the shoulder with practised speed, while Henry cried out once, and then bit his lip hard. Patricia let him crush her fingers through the worst of it. When it was done, the boy sagged with exhaustion, lashes wet. "Do not sleep yet," she murmured. "Talk to me. Tell me about your dog." He whispered, "Bram Steele's pies," and she managed, despite everything, a breath that almost resembled a laugh. Not quite a smile crossed the Duke's mouth and was gone at once. By the time the bandage was tied and the sling secured, the dining room scarcely resembled the stage Lady Norwood had set an hour earlier. Place cards lay stacked on the sideboard, abandoned. Candles burned lower in their branches. Mud tracked across expensive carpets. Rain kept striking the glass in steady sheets, refusing elegance. Dr. Weller straightened and addressed the Duke. "He must be moved upstairs now, carefully, with support at neck and shoulder. I shall stay the night." The Duke inclined his head. "You have what you need." His hand came to Henry's hair for the briefest touch. "You did well." The child's eyes, heavy now, turned toward Patricia. "She pulled me out," he whispered. "Cold water." The Duke's gaze followed to Patricia, and for an instant she felt pinned in place by the full weight of his attention. Not as servant, not as ornament, but as fact, He stood. Water fell from the hem of his coat onto the polished floor. "You were at the bridge," he said to her. "Yes, Your Grace." "You gave him your shawl." She had forgotten the shawl entirely until that moment. It had been her only dry layer after the plunge into run water, and she had wrapped it around Henry without thought while grooms argued. He was shivering. "You refused my steward's purse." Heat rose under her skin, despite the cold in her bones. "I asked that no man lose his post for an accident." His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in concentration, as if placing one piece of evidence beside another. "You ask oddly for someone in your position, Miss Schmidt." She folded her stinging hands together. "I ask according to consequence, Your Grace." For the first time that night, he gave her a look unmediated by command, long enough to unsettle and sober all at once. Then he turned to the nearest footman. "Carry Master Henry to the blue bedchamber, slowly. Miss Schmidt walks beside him." Lady Norwood stepped in quickly. "Surely Martha can attend. Miss Schmidt has duties below." The Duke did not glance her way. "Miss Schmidt walks beside him." The second command left no room for amendment. Patricia rose, knees protesting after so long on hard floor, and moved to Henry's side as two footmen lifted him with the boards beneath. He gripped her sleeve with his uninjured hand, small fingers fierce. She let him. At the threshold she looked back once, because instinct demanded it, because one did not leave Lady Norwood's dining room without permission and remain unpunished. Lady Norwood stood rigid by the hearth, face composed into social calm that did not reach her eyes. Eleanor and Jane hovered behind her, suddenly young and uncertain. The Duke remained near the fire, broad shoulders squared, one hand braced on the mantel, as if holding the room itself in place by force of will. When Patricia turned again toward the corridor, his voice came after her, low and unmistakable. "Do not leave this hall tonight without my word." The command followed her up the stairwell like a hand at her back, and she felt it at each landing while the footman carried Henry between them, boards steady under his slight weight, lamps throwing gold across walls gone dim with age. His fingers stayed twisted in her sleeve. When they reached the blue bedchamber, Dr. Weller directed the men to lower him by the hearth, and dismissed everyone except Patricia with a curt nod that treated her as a colleague rather than furniture. The small Grace struck harder than she expected. "More light," the surgeon said. She trimmed 2 candles, lit a third, and set the screen to block the draught. Rain drove against the casement in long diagonal lines. Wet wool steamed from the footmen's coats, where they waited for orders. Henry's face had gone pale beneath freckles. His lower lip trembled once. He swallowed it down. "You are not to sleep yet," Patricia said, kneeling beside him. "You may curse me for that in the morning." He tried for bravery and managed a whisper. "Uncle says cursing is for stable boys." "Then you may scowl at me instead." His mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but near enough to count. Dr. Weller examined pupils, pulse, and breath while Patricia held the lamp close and repeated each response in a clear voice. The boy answered when prompted, faltered, then answered again. When pain crested, he reached blindly for her hand, and she gave it without looking away from the surgeon's instruments. The pressure ground her swollen knuckles against bone. She did not flinch. By the time the corridor clock marked 10:30, the first edge of panic had passed. Henry lay propped against pillows with his arm secured and his colour marginally improved. Dr. Weller packed away his splints and rose with a crack of tired knees. "He must be watched through the night." "Wake him each hour. If he vomits, send for me at once." The surgeon's gaze shifted to Patricia. "You did right at the bridge, and in there." She bowed her head once. Praise felt dangerous in Blackthorn Hall, as if spoken credit might draw immediate punishment. A soft knock sounded. Martha entered carrying a tray with broth, linen, and a dry shirt, far finer than anything she had ever touched as her own. Behind her, in the corridor shadow, the Duke stood motionless. He did not cross the threshold. He watched his nephew breathe, watched Patricia lift the spoon, watched Henry refuse twice and then submit when she said quietly, "3 mouthfuls, then you may hate me in comfort." Henry obeyed. Between sips he murmured, "Do not go." Patricia brushed damp hair back from his brow. "I am here." "Promise." Her throat tightened at the force in that small voice. "I promise until your fever settles." Only then did she sense the Duke's attention move from the bed to her face, searching it for the cost of the promise she had made so easily for another person's child. Martha set the folded shirt at the bedfoot. "For Miss Schmidt," she said too quickly, not meeting anyone's eyes. Patricia glanced down at herself and saw what urgency had hidden. Her service dress was stiff where river water and blood had dried. Mud had climbed to her thighs. One cuff had torn open, exposing bruised skin Lady Norwood preferred to deny existed. She did not reach for the shirt. "It is not mine," she said. The Duke answered from the doorway. "It is now." She looked up. Candlelight sharpened the scar along his temple and hollowed his cheekbones, giving him the severe stillness of carved stone. He gave no explanation and no comfort, only the sentence, only the permission. Patricia took the shirt. "Thank you, Your Grace." He inclined his head toward the passage. "Mrs. Ellison will show you the dressing closet. 5 minutes." She understood the order beneath the words. Warmth, dry cloth, protection disguised as efficiency. It unsettled her more than open anger would have done. Mrs. Ellison, the housekeeper, appeared as if summoned from the panelling itself, grey hair pinned severe, eyes sharp with old loyalties. She led Patricia through a narrow service door into the closet adjoining the chamber. Steam from a copper basin rose into the cold air. Patricia stripped off her soaked bodice with fingers gone clumsy, washed mud from her wrists, and changed into the Duke's offered shirt, plain linen, too broad through the shoulders, sleeves rolled 3 times before her hands emerged. The fabric smelled faintly of starch and cedar instead of lavender and command. She tied her ruined skirt back over it and stared at her reflection in a spotted mirror. She looked like no rank she understood. Not servant, not lady, not guest. Something in transit, unfinished and unpermitted. When she stepped out, Henry's eyelids were dropping despite effort. Dr. Weller pressed 2 fingers to his pulse, satisfied himself, and moved toward the door. The Duke shifted aside for him and spoke low enough that Patricia almost missed it. "Will he keep the arm?" "He will, if he obeys, and if fever stays away." The Duke's shoulders lost one hard degree of tension, then reset at once. He entered fully, crossed to the bed, and stood looking down as Henry breathed. He did not touch the child this time. He simply stood close enough that the boy would see him on waking. Patricia had seen men kneel in chapel with less reverence. Henry opened his eyes a slit. "Uncle!" "I am here." "Do not send her away." The Duke's gaze flicked to Patricia, unreadable, then back. "Sleep in short intervals. That is your task." "And hers?" His jaw tightened. "She has hers." Henry drifted. Patricia stepped back to give them room, but the Duke turned before she could reach the door. "You will return downstairs." She froze. "Now! Now!" The word held no cruelty, yet dread moved through her as quickly as cold river water had. Downstairs waited Lady Norwood, guests, unfinished courses, and the bill for every minute Patricia had not been available to serve. The Duke seemed to read some part of that calculation in her face. "You walk beside me," he said. They went down together through the wide corridor lined with portraits and dead men's certainty. Servants flattened themselves against the wall as he passed. No one spoke to her. No one dared. The dining room had been restored with astonishing speed, as if disorder were a stain the house had trained itself to erase before rank could notice. Fresh cloth covered the table. Candles burned in new sockets. Muddy rugs had vanished, yet traces remained for anyone who knew where to look. A dark, damp line along the baseboard, one chair set a fraction askew, the scent of camphor layered over wet wool and fear. Guests had returned to their seats, voices softer now, laughter forced and brittle. Lady Norwood stood at the head of the table, one gloved hand on the back of her chair, the other resting near a leather folio bound for signatures. Her smile flashed when she saw the Duke, then dimmed when she saw Patricia at his side in a man's linen shirt under a plain skirt. "Your Grace," Lady Norwood said sweetly, "we are relieved to hear Master Henry is stable." "Miss Schmidt has imposed enough drama for one evening." Patricia started to retreat to the wall, but the Duke spoke first. "She remains." Only 2 words, final as a lock turning. Lady Norwood's nostrils flared once. She resumed her seat with visible effort and lifted her wine as if the interruption were a minor weather event. "Very well, we shall proceed with the final papers and spare everyone further delay." Mr. Halbridge leaned forward, dabbing his lips. Yes, the transfer should be witnessed before midnight." At that, Lady Norwood reached for the folio, opened it, and went still. Her hand rifled one pocket, then another. She turned pages with increasing speed. The room watched her composure crack by degrees. "Where is it?" she murmured. Eleanor bent in. "Mamma?" Lady Norwood snapped the folio shut hard enough to make the glasses ring. "My emerald seal is missing." A hush dropped over the table. The seal was not ornament. It was authority, used to stamp and finalise the sale papers she had spoken of all week. Without it, the evening's transactions stalled. Lady Norwood rose and let her gaze travel the servants lined along the panelling. She stopped on old Mr. Pritchard, first footman these 30 years, shoulders bent from carrying silver and silence through 3 households. He had a wife confined to bed in the village, everyone knew it, and 2 married daughters too poor to help as they wished. He stood rigid now, hands flat at his sides. "You brought my folio from the morning room," Lady Norwood said. "Yes, my lady." "And now the seal is gone." His face drained of colour. "I did not touch it, my lady." "Did not?" Her voice rose, sharpened for performance. "You were seen lingering near my writing desk this afternoon." Pritchard swallowed. "I was dusting, my lady, as instructed." "Search him," Lady Norwood said to Thomas. Thomas hesitated. "My lady—" "Search him." Patricia felt the room tilt toward the familiar shape of injustice. An old servant accused in public, a swift dismissal, no reference, no wages due, no medicine for his wife. She saw Pritchard's hands begin to shake and knew what would follow because it had followed for others. Blame was cheapest when placed on those too weak to contest it. She stepped forward before caution could chain her to the wall. "If there has been mishandling, the fault is mine." Lady Norwood turned slowly, triumph brightening her face. At last, honesty. Patricia kept her voice level. "I carried trays past the folio. I may have displaced it." Martha made a strangled sound at the service door. Pritchard stared at Patricia as if she had struck him. Lady Norwood drew herself up. "Then you admit theft?" "I admit proximity," Patricia said, "not theft." "Convenient distinction." Lady Norwood looked around the table, inviting condemnation. "You witness her, all of you. My ward, in borrowed gentleman's linen, now confessing interference with legal papers." Patricia ignored the burn in her cheeks. She glanced once toward Mrs. Ellison, who stood halfway down the wall, hands folded over her keys, expression carefully blank. Patricia moved 2 steps, as if yielding space, passed near enough that her skirt brushed the housekeeper's, and spoke without moving her lips. "Lavender-lined desk, left inner drawer, false bottom." Mrs. Ellison's eyelids flickered. No other sign. Lady Norwood advanced until they stood only a yard apart. "Where is the seal, Miss Schmidt?" Patricia met her gaze. "If I had intended theft, I would not stand here." The words were too direct. The room inhaled. Lady Norwood lifted her hand as if to strike, remembered the Duke's order, and let it fall to her side in a tremor of contained fury. "Your Grace," she said, turning toward him with practised appeal, "you see how she repays shelter. Shall I call the constable?" The Duke had not moved from the doorway since entering. Rain sounded behind him in steady percussion. He watched Patricia, not Lady Norwood. "Call whom you please," he said. The neutrality in his tone gave Lady Norwood confidence she had not earned. She snapped at Thomas. "Fetch the constable from the gate and have the maid search Miss Schmidt's room." Patricia did not protest. Protest would only certify guilt in this room. She clasped her hands before her to hide their trembling, and stood beside Pritchard as if they were equal defendants before a magistrate neither had chosen. Minutes stretched. Guests whispered behind fans. Jane's eyes glittered with anticipation. Eleanor pretended distress and failed. Mr. Holbridge stared at the folio as if willing business to resume by force of impatience. Then Mrs. Ellison returned. She crossed the room without haste, carrying something wrapped in a square of white linen. She stopped before Lady Norwood, unfolded the cloth, and revealed the emerald seal, its green stone catching candlelight like cold fire. "It was in the lavender-lined writing desk, my lady," Mrs. Ellison said, "left in a drawer, beneath the false board." The silence that followed was so complete Patricia could hear water striking the outer sill. Lady Norwood's face emptied, then refilled with anger too large to conceal. "Who told you to look there?" Mrs. Ellison did not glance at Patricia. "I searched all likely places, my lady." "Liar!" The word cracked across the room. The Duke's voice came just after it, low and lethal. "No," Lady Norwood spun toward him. "Your Grace, this is my household." His gaze shifted at last from Patricia to Lady Norwood, and what lay in it was not heat but verdict. "Not for much longer, if you continue to mistake accusation for proof." Patricia felt Pritchard sway beside her. She steadied him with one hand under his elbow, small gesture hidden by the fall of her skirt. He whispered hoarse, "Why would you do that, miss?" "Because your wife needs your wages. Because someone must refuse the easy cruelty. Because she had watched too many good people ruined in silence." She did not say any of it. She only answered, "Stand straight, Mr. Pritchard." He did. Lady Norwood snatched the seal from the linen and pressed it to her palm hard enough to blanch the skin. "This farce has consumed enough of my evening," she said. "We sign now." She reached for the folio again. From the corridor came the measured tread of more than one man approaching. Boots neither hurried nor hesitant. Each step deliberate, as if timed to a decision already made. The Duke did not turn his head. He kept his eyes on Patricia, on the shaking she still fought to hide, on the mud stain that remained at her hem, on the bruises no one had permission to name except him. When the footsteps halted at the threshold, he said, without looking away from her, "You may release your breath, Miss Schmidt." She had not known she was holding it until her lungs burned. The men at the threshold entered on the Duke's unspoken permission. Mr. Fenwick in a rain-dark cloak, with his leather case held tight against his chest. Constable Hales in plain wool with damp at his shoulders, and a younger clerk carrying a locked tin box with both hands as if it were church plate. Candlelight struck water from their hems. No one at the table rose to greet them. Even Mr. Hulbridge forgot his manners and stared. Lady Norwood recovered first. "Constable," she said with brittle relief, "you arrive in useful time. Miss Schmidt has interfered with legal property. I require her searched and removed." Constable Hales did not move toward Patricia. He looked to the Duke. Elias Ashcombe stood as he had stood all evening, broad shoulders squared near the doorway, one hand resting on the carved chair back, as if he held a line no one else could see. "You will wait," he said. Lady Norwood's laugh came thin and high. "Your Grace, with respect, this is my house." His gaze shifted to her and stayed there. "No." The single word silenced crystal and breath alike. Patricia felt it in her ribs. Mr. Fenwick stepped forward, removed his gloves with slow fingers, and bowed first to the Duke, then to the room. "I was summoned under seal to witness and execute instructions attached to the Schmidt Trust, contingent upon evidence of fraud in estate management. I am prepared to proceed." Lady Norwood's face altered in stages. Disbelief first, then calculation, then anger made elegant by effort. "There is no such contingent instruction. Otto left debts and broad discretion to his widow, as you very well know." Fenwick's lined mouth tightened. "I know precisely what the late Mr. Schmidt signed in my office, in the presence of 2 witnesses, now deceased and 1 living." He nodded toward the clerk. "Mr. Ames was apprentice then. He remains in my employ." At the edge of Patricia's vision, Eleanor's fingers closed around Jane's wrist hard enough to blanch the knuckles. Jane looked down at her plate, suddenly fascinated by nothing. Lady Norwood turned on Patricia with all softness stripped away. "What have you done?" Patricia held her hands clasped before her, because they still trembled, and because hiding weakness had become reflex. "Nothing beyond speaking when asked." "Liar!" The word struck across the room again, sharper than the first time. The Duke took 1 step away from the doorway. His boots sounded once on the parquet. He stopped beside Patricia, not touching her, close enough that she could feel the heat from his soaked coat through the thin linen shirt she wore. "Not another word of that kind," he said to Lady Norwood. "You have spent years spending words as if they were unrecorded coin. Tonight they are entered." Patricia turned her head a fraction. She had not heard anyone speak of language as ledger before, except her father. Something in her chest tightened unexpectedly. Lady Norwood lifted her chin. "I will not be lectured in my own dining room by a guest who arrived to discuss purchase." "I arrived," he said, each syllable precise, "to prevent theft." The room went still in a different way after that. Not startled, braced. By the time the long case clock marked 11:15, Mr. Fenwick had set his case on the end of the table and opened it. Wax, folded vellum, copies, and a ribboned packet were laid out in exact order. The clerk unlocked the tin box, produced a ledger wrapped in oilcloth, and passed it to Fenwick, who passed it without comment to the Duke. Patricia knew the wrapping before she saw the crack in one corner where she had melted too much wax last month. Her breath stopped. The Duke held the packet out to her. "Yours." She did not take it at once. "How?" "Mrs. Ellison found it when Lady Norwood ordered your attic searched. I instructed that nothing leave your possession unsealed." He said it plainly. No triumph, no apology. A fact placed before witnesses. Lady Norwood spun toward the housekeeper. "You had no authority." Mrs. Ellison stood with keys at her waist and eyes level. "I took authority from necessity, my lady." Constable Hales shifted his weight and fixed his attention on the far wall, but Patricia saw the corner of his mouth tighten, as if he recognised the sentence for what it was. an old servant choosing at last a side. Mr. Halbridge rose half out of his chair. This is highly irregular. A private dinner is not a court. Fenwick looked at him over his spectacles. No, a private dinner is where some people choose to commit themselves in front of solvent witnesses. Sit down. Halbridge sat. The Duke addressed the constable without taking his eyes off Patricia. You were called by Lady Norwood to seize Miss Schmidt. You will remain to hear evidence first. Hales nodded once. Yes, Your Grace. Patricia finally took the oilcloth packet. It felt heavier than paper should. Her thumb found the old wax seam and pressed there, grounding herself in texture and memory. These were her copies, her nights. Her hunger turned into numbers. She had hidden them under a loose board because she had no lawful door left to knock upon. Now they lay in candlelight before the same people who had laughed at her vowels. She could not decide if she wanted to be sick or grateful. The Duke's voice, lowered, meant for her, and still audible to all. You counted correctly. It was not praise in a gentle tone. It was recognition in his own language. It landed deeper than comfort would have. Fenwick cleared his throat and lifted one vellum sheet bearing Otto Schmidt's hand and seal, older wax darkened with time. I will read the relevant clauses, Lady Norwood snapped. You will not. Elias did not raise his voice. You will sit. She remained standing one long second, silk whispering as her chest rose and fell. Then she sat, rigid as carved wood. Fenwick began. He read slowly, each clause pronounced with legal weight. Otto Schmidt being of sound mind. Establishment of an irrevocable trust for his daughter Patricia Elise Schmidt, sole issue of his first marriage. Temporary stewardship granted to Lady Norwood for maintenance only, not alienation. Sale, mortgage or transfer of Blackthorn Hall prohibited until Patricia's 23rd birthday, unless countersigned by trustee and beneficiary. Upon credible evidence of falsified debt instruments, suppressed rents, or coercive disposal of beneficiary property, stewardship rights terminated immediately and reverted by operation of trust. Every sentence scraped away one layer of the fiction Patricia had been forced to inhabit. She gripped the edge of the oilcloth packet until the wax cracked under her thumb. Fenwick continued, Beneficiary attains legal majority under this trust at age 23. Date verified by parish and civil record. This day. Jane made a small, strangled sound. Eleanor shut her fan with a snap. Lady Norwood laughed again, but now the sound shook. Credible evidence. You have none beyond a resentful girl's copied psalms and village gossip. The Duke held out his hand toward Fenwick. Papers changed hands. He laid 3 sheets on the table before Lady Norwood. North tenant rents collected in September and entered twice under separate headings. Repairs billed to a mason buried 3 years. 2 notes bearing Otto Schmidt's signature with pressure pattern inconsistent across identical flourishes. Your private secretary admits under statement that you directed him to copy the late Mr. Schmidt's hand from old correspondence. Lady Norwood's composure slipped. He is dismissed. His word is worthless. His word is corroborated by bank drafts, Fenwick said, and by Miss Schmidt's ledger copies made contemporaneously over 12 weeks, dates matching entries your own books now attempt to erase. Patricia stared at the pages. She had copied those lines with numb fingers and a stump of pencil because ink had run out. She remembered the candle sputtering. She remembered counting while her stomach cramped. She remembered believing none of it would matter if no one in rank agreed to look. Now all of them were looking. The Duke placed one more item on the table. The pawn receipt from Mr. Keel, creased where Patricia had folded it into her sleeve that morning. "You sold Hall silver before dawn," he said to Lady Norwood. "Not for coal, for private debt." Lady Norwood's eyes cut to Patricia with naked hatred. "You searched my things," Patricia answered before fear could stop her. "You sent me to pawn it." For the first time in years she did not lower her eyes after speaking. The Duke turned slightly toward her, and she felt the movement without seeing it. "Say that again." She swallowed once. Her voice came steadier than she felt. "Lady Norwood ordered me to carry 6 candlesticks to market before dawn and return with coin. Mr. Keel issued that receipt. I counted the payment twice." Fenwick held out his palm. Patricia gave him the receipt. He compared signatures, nodded, and passed it to Constable Hales. Hales read, then looked up. "Date and amount align with unauthorized disposition if trust restrictions stand." "They stand," Fenwick said. Lady Norwood rose so abruptly her chair tipped and struck the floor. "This is collusion, a duke's interference to ruin a widow. I will appeal." "You may petition," Fenwick replied, "from outside this house." Constable Hales stepped forward then, hat in hand, manner formal. "Lady Norwood, I am required to ask for surrender of your keys and any instrument bearing the late Mr. Schmidt's signature pending examination." "You dare!" "I execute warrants, my lady. I do not author them." She looked toward the guests for rescue. None met her eyes. Mr. Hulbridge examined his cuff. One lady adjusted a bracelet. Another studied the candle wax, as if it was scripture. Elias spoke again, and this time the words were for the room entire. "Hear this clearly. No staff member is to be dismissed tonight. No wages are to be withheld. No trunk leaves Blackthorn without Miss Schmidt's written consent." His gaze settled on Patricia as he said the next line. "Her consent." Something broke open behind her ribs then. Not tears, not relief, something harder and cleaner. For years she had been addressed as burden, ward, girl, foreign inconvenience. In one sentence he had redrawn the house around her name. Lady Norwood's glove buttons flashed as her hands shook. "You set this from the start. The bridge, the child, this theatre." A muscle moved once in the Duke's jaw. "Your cruelty set it. I merely arrived in time to witness." He did not move away from Patricia, not an inch. Even when Constable Hales requested Lady Norwood's keys, and Mrs. Ellison produced the household ring with steady hands. Even when Jane began to cry in thin, offended gasps, and Eleanor hissed at her to be quiet. Even when Thomas lifted the fallen chair and set it upright as if furniture could restore rank, Fenwick gathered the signed acknowledgments one by one. "Miss Schmidt," he said, turning toward her with formal gravity, "as of this reading and attested evidence, management rights and beneficial ownership are vested in you under the trust. Immediate authority is yours." The words reached her as if through water. She looked down at her hands, at split knuckles and swelling and ink in the cuticles that no amount of scrubbing ever removed. These hands now held title. These hands had served every person at this table. These hands shook, the Duke noticed. Of course he noticed. He leaned closer, voice low enough that only she heard. "Stop bracing for the blow. There is none coming." She drew breath, slow and painful, because her body did not believe him yet. Across the table, Lady Norwood gave a sound between a laugh and a sob, and looked at Patricia as if seeing her for the first time and hating the sight. "You will fail in a month." Patricia lifted her head. She felt the Duke beside her still as winter stone, a presence that did not press, yet did not yield. She heard her own accent when she answered, clean and unhidden. "Then it will be my failure. In my house." No one laughed, and in that silence Constable Hales stepped to Lady Norwood's chair and held out his hand for the keys. She stared at him, as if rank alone could unmake the request, then stripped the ring from her chatelaine with a violent motion and dropped it into his palm. The metal struck skin with a sound small enough to be missed and final enough to end a life. "Eleanor, Jane, we are leaving," she said. Neither daughter moved until the Duke shifted his gaze toward them, and then they gathered their skirts and obeyed their mother without a word, their painted composure gone thin as damp paper. At the threshold, Lady Norwood turned back, not to Patricia but to the room, as if one last audience might restore her. "You all know this is indecent." "Mister!" Halbridge lowered his eyes first. Others followed. No one answered her. Constable Hales inclined his head toward the hall. "My lady!" The front doors opened to rain and 2 waiting guards from the village post. They did not touch her. They did not need to. Lady Norwood walked between them with her back straight and her silk darkening at the hem in the wet. Eleanor and Jane went after her, one on each side, jewels flashing once in candlelight before the night took them. The door shut. The sound rolled through the panels and died. Patricia remained where she stood, one hand on the oilcloth packet, the other braced against the table edge because her knees had begun to shake now that she was no longer required to stand still for survival. The dining room smelled of extinguished wax, wet wool, and spilled wine. Rain dragged silver lines down the long windows. Her father's brass candlesticks burned at uneven heights, exactly as they had when she polished them that afternoon, while the 6 silver sticks had gone to pawn before dawn. Fenwick began arranging documents with careful urgency. "Miss Schmidt, we should secure signatures tonight while witnesses remain sober. The transfer inventory, the seizure receipts, the declaration of stewardship termination." Patricia nodded, though she heard him through a kind of ringing. Mrs. Ellison came to her left shoulder. "You must sit, miss." "I am quite all right." "You are swaying." It was true. She sat. By 11 o'clock the witnesses had signed. Fenwick folded each page and sealed each fold with new wax in front of her. Constable Hales logged every seized item aloud while the clerk wrote. 2 debt instruments with disputed signatures, 1 private account book from Lady Norwood's desk, 1 packet of copied tenant ledgers provided by Miss Patricia Schmidt, 1 pawn receipt from Mr. Keel, 1 emerald household seal recovered by Mrs. Ellison from the lavender-lined desk. Each item went into the tin box under dual lock. Hales gave Patricia the first receipt copy and kept the second for magistrate filing at dawn. "Outcome should be entered by afternoon," he said, voice formal but not unkind. "If any challenge is lodged, you will be called to York within the week. If none is lodged, management stands fully uncontested." Fenwick added, "I shall send a rider to the bank before first light to freeze all estate outflows not authorised by your hand." She signed where he indicated. Her name looked strange on legal paper, after years of being forbidden the right to use it for anything that mattered. The last guest departed shortly before midnight. The staff remained in the passage, uncertain, exhausted, and watching her with the wary hope of people who had survived many false dawns. The Duke stood by the hearth, rain still drying on his greatcoat, as if he had never once considered leaving before the work was done. Henry was upstairs. Dr. Weller had sent word that he had taken broth and answered his name clearly. The danger had eased. Patricia rose from the chair at the head of the table. The papers in her hands trembled against one another. She could not stop that. She stopped apologising for it. The Duke crossed the distance between them and halted an arm's length away. "Choose freely," he said. "I will not command you." For a breath she saw every road at once. Gratitude twisted into obligation, protection mistaken for ownership, rescue becoming a softer cage. He had issued orders all evening. This was the first thing he had offered her that had no leash hidden in it. She lifted her chin. Her accent sat clear on each word. "You may stay as my guest, your grace, while I rebuild Blackthorn Hall. As guest only. I will sign no paper under pressure, and I will not be managed." His face did not change quickly, yet something in it eased, as if a locked muscle had released. "Agreed." By morning light, pale and thin through cloud, she convened the household in the old breakfast room, because the dining room still held too much of last night's theatre. Servants stood shoulder to shoulder, Martha with flour on her cuffs, Thomas hollow-eyed, Mr. Pritchard upright by force of will, maids with reddened hands, grooms smelling of hay and rain. Mrs. Ellison stood nearest the mantel, keyring now at Patricia's waist by unanimous insistence. Patricia held the wage ledger open where all could see. "No one will lose a post for last night," she said. "Back wages withheld these 6 months will be calculated and paid in 2 instalments, first on Friday, second at month's end. Mr. Pritchard, your full pay is restored from this date, and an additional allowance is approved for your wife's physician." Pritchard's mouth worked without sound. He bowed instead deeply, one hand over his heart. She continued, "Kitchen coal is doubled. Attic windows are to be repaired before the first hard freeze. Mrs. Ellison, please send for the glazier at once." A maid in the back began to cry quietly. Martha put an arm around her and glared at anyone who looked amused. No one did. At the end, Patricia said, "If any member of staff wishes to leave, you may do so with full reference. If you stay, we begin clean books today. No hidden deductions. No punishments entered as household expense." They stayed. 3 days passed before Mr. Keel arrived from market under constable notice, cap in both hands, to verify the pawn transaction in person. He read his own receipt aloud, confirmed Lady Norwood's written order bearing her seal, and signed deposition before Fenwick and Hales at Patricia's desk, in what had once been Otto Schmidt's study. The forged instruments were sent to a handwriting examiner in York. 1 week later, the report returned. Non-matching pressure pattern, simulated terminal flourish, traced hesitation marks. Fraud confirmed. Fenwick read the findings to Patricia in that same room, while rain tapped the panes exactly as it had the night she copied her first secret line under the attic eaves. Mrs. Ellison then produced a packet she had hidden years earlier after seeing letters opened and withheld. They were addressed to Patricia in Fenwick's hand, each requesting private meeting regarding trust review, each never delivered. Patricia read them all by the fire without speaking. Some loaded looks were explained only by paper. On a clear morning in early December, she had her father's portrait lowered from the shadowed landing and rehung in the library, where the light held steady through noon. She ordered the pianoforte unlocked. She asked Martha to bring tea to the library instead of the drawing room and drank it at her father's old table, while children's voices sounded in the corridor for the first time in years. The schoolroom reopened 2 days later. Village girls arrived in boots caked with winter mud, shawls patched at elbows, faces guarded with the same caution Patricia knew in her bones. She met them at the door herself. No governess was hired to stand between them. She taught numbers first, then reading from trade circulars and parish notices, then letter writing, then the legal words men like to hide costs inside. Mrs. Ellison kept attendance with military precision. Martha sent bread rolls still warm at midday. Mr. Pritchard, on good days, read maps aloud in a voice that shook only on the longest names. Henry returned at Christmastide in a careful sling and declared the lessons better than Latin. His uncle watched from the library threshold, while Patricia corrected Henry's sums and a line of girls copied freight totals in neat columns. He said nothing then. He watched everything. By the second week of May, the West Gardens had recovered enough from neglect to hold green again. Apple blossom lifted in the evening light. Patricia walked the winter garden path after dismissing the day pupils, ink still on her fingers, sleeves rolled, ledger tucked under one arm. She found the Duke waiting beneath the glass roof, where late sun made the damp panes glow like old amber. He did not kneel. He did not perform softness. He did not possess. He stood with his hat in his hand and a ring box closed in the other. "I have filed no claim on your estate," he said. "I have issued no instruction in your house without your consent since November. I am asking now." She set the ledger on the stone bench between them. "Trade, then heart. Equal terms." "Ask plainly." His jaw tightened once. "Marry me, Patricia Schmidt. Keep your name, your accounts, your schoolroom, and your authority. Join my household only if Blackthorn remains yours, in law and practice." She held his gaze for a long moment, listening to the old fear that marriage was transaction and erasure, listening also to the newer evidence, a man who had moved power away from himself when it would have been easier to keep it. The crux of trust was not passion, it was pattern. "Yes," she said, "as equal partnership, nothing less." "Nothing less," he answered. When he placed the ring in her palm, she closed her fingers over it and felt with quiet astonishment that her hands no longer shook